Thank you so much. That's just really nice, really great to hear. For me, really, like, being clear is quite important. And I remember just being very scared as a junior person about being clear in case it seemed like I didn't know anything. It was sort of that moment where you had to absolutely befuddle everyone in the room to seem smart. And I guess for me, I really wanted to communicate, and we all know how to do that because we are undergraduate teachers, and undergrads are always really good indicators of whether you're getting across or not because they'll fall asleep pretty quick. So in a large lecture class, if I only have 2 sleepers, that's usually that's my benchmark at any given moment. So, but I think it's true, like in academia, right? We don't value that enough in the US, even though people are actually very fluent in some ways. I mean, Stuart Hall was very critical of US cultural studies for the fact that people develop theoretical fluency that allows you to talk on and on without ever saying anything. And we've all been in the presence of that too, which is sort of an academic problem. But I think that that's part of trying to turn education into something meaningful in an age where the university is a brand name, is trying to communicate. And I mean, I wouldn't even think of myself in a position to offer you advice other than, as you said, that one struggles to find a voice, right? A voice that isn't just the voice of the discipline, that isn't pretending to be plain language. Because we all have a perspective and an opinion, and we all have an authorial signature. And I thought Jarrod's talk in many ways was thinking through that, that authorial signature. That is really important in order for people to like make a connection to the work, because God knows it's hard to get people to read academic work. I personally don't think I do it very well. I would like to be able to write a popular book, and I have not been able to do so. And I think that I thought that it was a lot easier to write a popular book than it is. And I have great respect for people who are able to really make that crossover, where you write something that academics think is interesting, but it has a whole other audience. So,
feminist scholars of the 60s and 70s pointed to the work of anthropologists and also historians, and not just feminists of the social sciences, as a way of challenging biologically deterministic accounts of gender and also sexuality. And today I think feminist scholars still use the work of anthropologists and historians to challenge the work of sociobiologists on gender and sex. And it seems to me trans scholars, and by that I mean scholars who are trans-identified and scholars who work on trans studies, are similarly using the work of anthropologists and historians and just any work on sort of the global South, also as part of a larger intellectual project of detaching sex now also from biology and challenging biologically deterministic accounts of sex and gender and sexuality. And I guess I wonder if we can avoid that. I mean, that obviously reflects a certain cultural and social location, right? And it seems to me, I'm not sure that, and I'm wondering if any of you think that could be avoided in a more or should be avoided, right? That's clearly there's a theoretical and methodological agenda here, and it seems to me that shapes trans studies, whether it's focused on the local or the global.
I mean, I think that's nicely put, yeah. One doesn't know in advance the meaning of biology. Say in the female husbands of various rural communities, it's not biology, it's labor function that determines gender. And you're right, there is early feminist scholarship on that. The problem in relation to trans scholarship has been that feminism has been set up as an enemy, both in the US and elsewhere. And I think it's a really unfortunate squabble, I really do. And US trans scholars are deeply embedded in this idea that the problem is feminism, even though they often only cite Janice Raymond as an example. There isn't really a big group of feminists who are trans bashing, not in my experience, and I think it's a straw woman, really. So for me, that's the larger question, is whether one can actually break down this opposition between trans and feminism, because first of all, it does privilege, again, a white set of concerns where feminism somehow comes apart from other forms of activism around sexual identity, whereas women of color feminism may or may not have produced that same set of debates. My guess is it hasn't. So, yeah.
I have a question about the term female masculinity. I'd like to be proven to me, like what type of terms, such as this one, what makes them more correct? And are there examples of terms that are more political being somehow made, global? And how does that happen?
Well, I'll say a little something, but my guess is that maybe other people could speak to it, because this is, in a way, you've raised one of the big questions of the conference, which is about trying to translate certain meanings of embodiment from one context to another. That's exactly what we've been discussing. So it's not limited to female masculinity. That's the term that I use, because that was a study that I did, because I realized that in Euro-American cultures there was a sort of endless fascination with femininity in men, but a deep disdain and sort of disgust around masculinity in women. And so I wanted to name a set of embodiments that seemed to me to be united in relationship to a practice of socialization and marginalization. Okay, so we all know masculine women, we all see that there are masculine women in the world, and yet masculinity in women doesn't have either a ritual or a social or a political function. And so that was the term I came up with. But I think we're all discussing whether terms can circulate without performing an imperial function. Can a term circulate from a Euro-American context to elsewhere without having an imperial function, without, in other words, taking over any other terms that were already in circulation there? And we seem to have different answers to that question.
So I find that to be the issue with a lot of people from outside gender and women's studies, or a lot of fields like in the arts. Similarly, when there's so much a disagreement between what a term means from one scholar in the same field to another, than when you're somebody from another field trying to read an article. Right. So if you were to say, let's say, female masculinity, I would have no idea what you're referring to.
But you do know what I'm referring to, because it's actually, that is not at all an obfuscating term. It's a very clear announcement of what it's describing, masculinity in a female-bodied person. So the protestation that I have no idea what a term might mean is often colored by other kinds of prohibitions on naming that are actually part of that term. And so, like, when I was doing work on drag kings, people were like, drag king? Oh my gosh, what is that? Do you know what a drag queen is? Yes. Then you know what a drag king is. What is the disorientation here? And that suggests to us that these terms are not innocent. They are places where all kinds of social feelings, prejudices, and biases have collected. But you're right, terms are very specific to fields, but it is important to have terms. And I know a lot of young people who I encounter in classes, for example, who are just like, well, why are you so obsessed with categories? Why do we have to have categories for everything? Why can't you just be yourself or something? Well, we don't live in a world where you could imagine not being something, not being anything. And I know that's not what you're after, but however specific these terms are, we are discussing here at this conference how meaningful it is when one term is selected over another, and what kind of work that term does when it circulates.
I think I can give an example.
Okay, great.
Okay, do you know the term MSM? Okay, it's men who have sex with men. Okay, the term originates in HIV prevention work, because there's this anthropological recognition that actually in a lot of places in the world, men who have sex with men don't identify as gay at all. And so in the context of a health crisis, you need prevention efforts to reach that category. The problem is then MSM is a term that starts off to resist thinking about sexuality in identitarian ways. And now MSM has become kind of an identity in these very places where it was produced, in places where actually sexuality wasn't understood in identitarian terms. So there one has a term that actually kind of starts off with good intentions and with a recognition of cultural difference, and ends up reproducing the exact same thing that it went into the world to change. So I think that the trajectory of terms is unpredictable. So I also think okay, the terms gay and lesbian get a lot of bashing for kind of being Western impositions and imperial. But I think there are also certain places and times where those terms get taken up and appropriated and consumed from below in such ways that actually they can become politically powerful and they can do certain kinds of interesting political work. So I think we both need to understand the local and believe in practices of self-naming. But at the same time, there's also the risk that one develops, what can be called like the fetish of the local, which totally slides into that kind of exoticized notion of difference, that they are so different from each other we can never, that recognition is impossible. Terms are very important. The horrible thing is they're also always changing. So when I was younger, I had the fantasy that if I knew something, I knew it and it was going to stay there. Mm-hmm. And the thing about learning is actually it never stays there. And that actually one is in a continual process of unlearning and relearning what you already thought you knew. And I know that's maybe like a very humanities approach, but I think it's equally true of science. Like when my granny was in high school, the first thing they taught was that the first axiom of chemistry is you cannot split the atom. So I just think you need to love what you know, but you also need to know that it's going to change all the time. And so a term is never a mastery. It's like a provisional moment in a making sense of a shifting world.
I wanted to ask just one last question, maybe, because I wanted to ask a question about Jarrod's penises. Because this came up.
There are more than one.
Had to happen.
Because it came up earlier in your talk that there was some sort of disquiet about sort of the masculine assertions and insertions, I suppose, within the paper itself. But it seemed to me the question of sort of like trans-masculinity or masculinity without penises, that your penises actually had no integrity. They didn't hold together very well. They often found themselves where they weren't, and so I wanted to come back to that question about trans-masculinity or masculinity without penises, and see if we can maybe as a group say something more about it before we close.
I'm not sure this will answer the question, but the way, and there are lots of things one doesn't have time to do in a talk, but one of the things, the way this question comes back to the question of origins, the question of roots narratives that I'm interested in, is partly the connection that kind of question establishes with the text I didn't really talk about, which is the monolingualism of the other, the second part of that title is the prosthesis of origin, right? And so in French, prosthesis is protège, right? So it's without the S, right? So there's in French, there's a possibility for a confusion of the difference between the Greek prefix, which is still legible in the English version, and the Latin prefix pro, right? So the putting front, the penis as prosthesis, and the putting in front, which Jarrod keeps resisting by talking about his behind. There's a passage that I think I cut at the last minute where he's always talking about behind, right? Which connects to the looking back. That structures these narratives that I'm interested in, right? One aspect of the work on queer temporality